Welcome to the second quarter of this century. This is the premiere episode of the Board Chair series created by David Beatty and produced by me, Quinn Lawson. To introduce David, I want to share Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem's reference. From their time together at Rotman, Governor Macklem noted that competition to get into David's courses were always fierce, adding that his students were always left with new skills, new capacities, and new inspiration. That through his deep commitment, boundless energy, and genuine curiosity, David changed the landscape, and he has had a profound impact in boardrooms across Canada and beyond. Well, what better qualities to continue today as we aim to embody them in our series and board chair community. This 2026 board chair series is dedicated to hosting top performing chairs and creating a space where they can bring back and share candid field notes. This is a brisk 1 hour session. We're going to wrap up at 1:58. And so please add your questions to the chat and let's jump in. For today's session, David will interview Katie, followed by a one-on-one discussion, and then we'll open the floor to a few questions. Professor Beatty, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Quinn, and Happy New Year to everyone, and a special big hello to Kathleen Taylor. I can't imagine a Canadian who has had more experience in more different boardrooms as both an executive, a director, and a chair. So, Kathy, thank you so very much for joining us today. Let's start off with some simple things like, what do you remember about your first director role?
Oh, I remember my first director role very well, David. And first off, before I dive into that, thanks so much for having me on the podcast, and Happy New Year to all of our listeners, and thanks for being with us. My first director role was back in the late 90s when I was a senior executive at Four Seasons, not yet the president of Worldwide Business Operations. And the Eaton family came to Izzy Sharp and said, we're going to go public again. And we would like to build a new board, and we need some women for that board. We're wondering if Katie would be the candidate for that. Izzy talked to me about it. I said, oh, this sounds very interesting. So I joined the board in the early part of 1998. Those of you who have good memories will recall that the company had just emerged from a bankruptcy filing, done its restructuring, and we were gung-ho to drive growth in the business going forward. We had a brand new CEO, George Kotsich, that we'd recruited away from the Hudson's Bay Company. So we went public on June the 10th, after a short stint of getting ready with prospectuses and the like. By June 30, we were doing a little bit more restructuring, and by September 11th, we were already in profit forecast revisioning. So it was a very, very difficult first few months. By November 16th of the same year, our CEO, our much lauded CEO, had resigned. And by the end of that year, we were preparing for another restructuring. The company eventually filed again in August of 1999. So if I said to David, I've done a whole class on this at Rotman, the governance learnings from everything that went on in that just over 12-month period for me. And it was a very, very interesting baptism into the world of corporate boards.
And time consuming too, I would guess, Katie. You must have spent half your life there.
Well, that goes to one of the learnings was when you're joining a board, really think about independence on the board. In the end, It turned out that we only had two truly independent directors, myself and the much awarded Phil Orsino. The brothers obviously not independent. Our CFO was not independent. And our then chair, Brent Ballantyne, became our interim CEO, so also not independent. So when all of this work came around, Katie and Phil were on point.
Wow. So in 2001, you then joined the RBC board.
That's correct.
And was it then filled only with operating CEOs, or describe the board as you found it, because it had just transformed itself from being CEO chair led by Mr. Cleghorn to having David O'Brien take over. Or no, I guess not. David hadn't taken over. John was still chair CEO.
Well, no, when Gordon Nixon became our CEO, we had an
Yeah.
independent chair, Monsieur Saint-Pierre from Montreal, and ultimately that was when the roles were split. So this was 2001, I think, was Gord's first year as CEO. He was in the mindset of adding new people to the board, and approached me about standing for candidacy.
Wonderful. Yeah. And you stayed there for a full, I think, 13 years before you became the chair. Is that correct?
Yes. So joined in 2001, was named chair in August of 2013, officially took over from David O'Brien in January of 14.
And you had previously, though, been chair of audit, chair of HR, chair of governance. You'd done all of the intermediate jobs in that time period, right?
Yeah. Well, I served as a member of the audit committee. I became chair of the HR committee, and ultimately also served on the corporate governance committee and the risk committee before I became chair.
The risk. Yes, right. Good for you. So you had a pretty thorough knowledge of the business of the bank out of the hospitality industry by the time somebody said, let's make you the chair.
That's correct. I'd learned the business as best you can when you're not running it, but also had learned the people and the culture, which is a very important part of being an effective director.
Yeah, and how did you get to be chair? How did that election occur? Were you asked to leave the room and hands went up, or what happened?
Well, in that particular case, the planning for David O'Brien's succession had started a couple of years earlier. And so part of me becoming chair of the Human Resources Committee was the idea that we had to get more and next generation folks into those committee chairs. I often say that board succession planning, particularly around committee succession planning, chair succession planning, is quite serious business. It's long-term business and it needs attention. And so I was asked to take on the HR chair role, I think largely to see whether or not I had the leadership chops that were required to become chair of the board. When the time eventually came, David O'Brien did a canvass of the board, of the people who were ready, willing, and able to take on the role. And ultimately, it was a great honor to be selected by my colleagues.
Yeah, the first female chair of a large Canadian bank and the largest single company in the Toronto Stock Exchange. Congratulations. It's quite a coup. And were you reviewed every year by the board or every 3 years, or were there external evaluations of your performance?
Oh, yes. As board chair, part of the board evaluation process was chair evaluation. And so the chair of the governance committee, which when I first took over as board chair, the governance committee chair and the board chair were the same person. One of my first decisions, with the encouragement of my colleagues, was to split those roles. And Heather Monroe Bloom became the governance chair there, and she was very, very, very helpful in getting me settled as a brand new board chair. But over the years, was able to garner feedback from colleagues on things that they thought I was doing well, things that I could be doing better. It was not a shy board, so much of the feedback would come direct as well. But we did have a very formal evaluation process, not only for me, but for the entire board.
Okay. And what was your biggest learning through those 9 years of evaluations about your own performance, what you did more of and what you maybe should have done less of?
Well, I think the biggest learning is for being a board chair is you don't know what you don't know. If for me, this was my first time chairing the board of a public company, and obviously, as you point out, of a very significant public company with complex operations and a large and very dedicated board. So the learning of what goes into being a great chair is something that you kind of find your feet on. I do a lot of coffee chats with people who are taking on these roles for the first time, share a lot of feedback around that, and really try to help people, because the first year or two You're learning the process of being a board chair. You're learning what it takes to manage the board. You're getting to know
Yeah.
your colleagues in a very, very different way than you may have before.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a multi-dimensional transformation that occurs. In terms of examples of directors who you really admired and respected and learned from, could you give us any specific names from your past?
Oh, well, the list is probably too long, and I wouldn't want to leave
Yeah.
anybody out. But if you think about the boards I've had the privilege to serve on,
Yep.
some fantastic directors that I had the privilege of working with at RBC. I was also served on the CPP Investments Board for almost
Oh,
10
yeah.
years.
Okay.
Um,
Yep.
and uh, and that board, although not a public company, operates at the highest standards of governance,
Mhm.
and not only in terms of its processes, but also in terms of its selection. So through that, I got to know directors on both sides of the border, literally across every province in the country. Very, very privileged. And today I serve on the Air Canada board, the ADECO board in Zurich, again,
Yep.
both with very geographically and otherwise diverse operators. So it's been a wonderful education for me, not only in my own learning, but to learn from colleagues.
Yeah, terrific. In terms of I always think of the job of the chair as being to be, in a way, the best friend of the CEO. If the chair
Mhm.
CEO relationship is not functioning, basically nothing's going to work. Do you agree with that? And what did you do to make that happen in your case with Gord and then Dave?
I absolutely do agree with that. In fact, when I joined the Element Board, it was with the intention of me becoming the chair, and that was a
Yeah,
new dynamic as well because I'm a brand new director, and I'm coming in from the outside. David Dennison, one of those very revered
yeah,
corporate directors, was the one who recruited me to replace him there. And one of the things I said to him was, "Well, first things first, we need to find out whether or not Laura." And I actually really, really, really like each other and are going to get along from a
yeah,
mindset,
yeah.
strategy,
Right.
working process perspective, because you can't make a success out of a board chair, and I maybe even argue CEOs become more successful when they have the right chairs in place as well. So could not be a more critical relationship.
Yeah. So how did you make that work, say, with Gord Nixon or Dave Mackay at the RBC? Did you have an office in the RBC? Do you have a secretary? Do you see them
Yep.
every day, every week, every month?
Yep.
Talk a little bit about the nature of the and frequency of the interchanges.
Sure. So Gord and I were together for a very short period of time because you'll
Yeah.
remember I was announced in August of 13, and Gord announced his retirement later that fall with a transition that happened the
Right.
following August. So I would say for the bulk of my time as chair at RBC, I was working with Dave Mackay. And
Yeah.
so the job there was in early days for the two of us to get to know each other better. Dave had been a member of the executive committee, but not somebody that I was dealing with day to day in my role as chair of the HR committee. So I would say
Yeah.
time is a big factor here, like in any relationship building exercise. The time that you set aside to spend with each other, to talk about the business, to talk about the people, talk about the challenges, talk about the
Mhm.
opportunities, but honestly, to get to know each other and the way each other thinks is a
Yeah.
critical element of that too. In terms of how we structured it, obviously the CEO of Canada's largest corporation at the time and a huge financial institution has a pretty busy schedule. So we
Yeah.
obviously kept flexibility to speak to one another anytime we needed to, but we did have a very set schedule for getting together. Usually in person. Obviously, the pandemic interrupted that and changed things a little bit. But generally speaking, we would hold our meetings in person. So the obvious ones would be pre-board and post-board. Um,
Yep.
that were critical to getting us set up for success in using the board's time very effectively, and then coming back with what worked, what needs more work, what needs to come back, what were some of the in-camera discussions that maybe unfolded. So those would be set and well programmed, and then we would always have another meeting in between that was also scheduled and set in person. We called that the midpoint. And that we would just get together to make sure that we were both in sync, and that I was caught up on anything that was emerging in the business. I did have an office at the bank. My office was with the corporate secretariat, who I spent an awful lot of time with, getting ready for board meetings, both you know, in the planning of the agendas, the planning of the outline of the time. And then obviously talking afterwards about, all right, we got to get set up for the next meeting. Banks meet very frequently, as you well know, David, more frequently than other boards. So the minute you're finished the February meeting, you're already planning for the next one.
Yeah, right. So your office was on the same floor as Dave's, or in a different floor? So
no, same building, different floor.
Okay.
But you know, I don't know, he was on 8, I was on 12. I moved around because the bank was renovating the offices while I was chair in the early years. So sometimes on 9, sometimes on 12, sometimes in the North Tower, but easy proximity. And I would say my access to Dave was unfettered, and my relationship with his fantastic EA was also very strong. So if I needed him or he needed me, we had a way of making that happen.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well done. Yes, I think without that, not so much cordiality as openness, transparency, and complete honestness about what's going on and what's happening and what's on my mind and what's on your mind, nothing's going to work at the board. So did he start off board meetings by having sort of a half hour of a CEO
we would. Yeah, we'd start our board meetings with an hour in camera with Dave, sometimes an hour and a half, depending on what was on the agenda.
Wow.
It would really depend if we were, you know, kind of in the middle of quite a big strategic set of decisions, or perhaps an acquisition, whatever it might be. It would really depend. Again, part of pre-board would be what's on Dave's list, what's likely to be on the board's list, how much time do we need for that, and really trying to manage to, again, optimum use of the board's time.
Yeah, that's great. I always use the word invest as opposed to how did we spend time, how did we invest time, in order to imply the notion of a return to the organization from our time investment. So I always thought of the agenda as the biggest investment decision the chair makes, because if you are allocating the time ineffectively, you really are not going to get any value out to the company, right?
I could not agree more.
Yeah.
I always say to people that time together is a board's scarcest resource, because it's already set. You can't make it longer. You can make it shorter if you have that opportunity, but it's very difficult, right? People fly in from different places. They've got other commitments. So you've got to figure out how to get the best out of that group for the time you have them together.
Yeah, exactly. That's super. Now, occasionally on boards, you get somebody who takes up a little too much airtime, or perhaps somebody who is a little too quiet when in fact there's a lot of potential value add. The end of a board meeting, how did you handle those things, or did you ever have that as a challenge?
Yeah, I think on every board there's always a challenge with making sure that everybody's contributing effectively. Nobody's adding, the phrase I like to use is adding too much value in certain sets of circumstances. And sometimes you do have to deal with that. Largely for me, those were things that I would deal with through regular meetings with my colleagues, coaching that would come out of the board effectiveness surveys that we would do every year. We would use a third party to do the surveys. We did peer surveys every year. So people were getting feedback from colleagues. And oftentimes I would also have feedback from colleagues, because I would do a one-on-one with all the board members each year to
Oh, you
get
did.
their
Okay, great. Yep.
additional feedback that they maybe didn't feel comfortable writing into the survey, or some color that they wanted to add, or sometimes I would have specific questions for them. But that was a great opportunity where if you had a director who was, as you say, potentially taking up too much airtime, or somebody who wasn't necessarily, you weren't necessarily feeling like they were bringing their all. There was great opportunity there to coach your colleagues, to get them to the highest level of their potential performance.
Yeah, so you met with every individual director one-on-one at least once a year then?
Yes.
Oh, good for
And
you.
I would generally travel to them. So if they had an office here in Toronto, I would try to go see them in their natural habitat, make it as easy as possible for people. Obviously, if it was out of town directors, I would tend to do that either on Zoom, to the extent that was invented then, or we would have a meal or a coffee or something when they were in town for a board cycle.
Okay. So if you estimated that, say, a normal director of a bank invested 300 hours a year, is the chair going to be investing 50% more than that, 450, or what would you guess?
Oh, you know what? I never really thought about it in terms of sort of time and materials that way. When I took on the role at Royal, it was, as I said earlier, a great honor, a job I'd never done before, and one that I wasn't necessarily educated in a formal sense on how to do. The only touchstones I had were watching other chairs who had done it before me. So I knew that I had a very steep learning curve, not only in the chair role, but also getting to know the bank in a way that would make me feel like I was doing my job correctly. So I set it up essentially to say, Royal Bank is my number one priority, and they essentially have unlimited access to my time. So in that regard, I gave my administrative assistant at the bank access to my email, access to my calendar, access to my life, so that they would have first call on my time. And I decided early in that piece, I'd agreed to join the CPP board, but I said that was it. I'm not doing anything else for at least 1 year until I know I have my feet underneath me. And I know what kind of time and attention this job is going to take. And with the benefit of hindsight, that worked well for me. I had CPP as a very established and professional board where I was also learning. I obviously had my own board at Four Seasons that I learned from. I mentioned the Edens board. I was also on the Sick Kids board in the philanthropy space. But the decision to really keep my responsibilities at that point very manageable until I knew what I needed to do, and we got into our rhythm with the CEO, with the corporate secretary, with the team. It gave me the space to do the learning I needed to do.
Yeah, and there's always a challenge that possibly there'll be some crisis that takes your entire life up on a board of directors.
That is the piece of coaching I give to everybody who's starting out in their board career, which is make sure you leave a lot of white space in your life, because if your CEO comes and says, oh, I've decided, which happened to us at CPP, I've decided to take a role elsewhere, all of a sudden now you're into CEO search and succession. And as you know from your experience, these are very, very time consuming. And it doesn't have to be that. It could be a big acquisition. It could be a restructuring. It could be any number of things. But yes, making sure you have a lot of elasticity in your time.
White space. Different topic, culture. What actually happens in the bank on the day-to-day street? And you, around the boardroom table, you pretty much eat what you're fed by the management team. What have you done to encourage your directors to get to know more about the bank and the bank people and how the bank actually runs, in fact?
Yeah. Well, I'd say we do a few things. Some of them would be template, but directors receive the morning media feed, so you're constantly up to date on all the news, both related to your institution, but also related to the industry. In addition to that, education sessions, which most high-performing boards are doing on topical issues. On top of that, encouraging the senior team to make sure they're bringing their high potential and critical team members with them to presentations, and giving them the opportunity to speak with the board, and giving the board the opportunity to exchange with them. One of the things we started to do, which was very well received, if we had a special presentation from one of the business operations or one of the functions, sometimes that evening, the board dinner would be centered on that team, not the senior people, but the next level down. And it was really a very useful enterprise for us. It was not threatening, because we were just trying to get to know these young, high potential folks. Gave us a chance to ask them about the work they were doing and get to know them a little bit. They probably, if they were high potential, actually showed up later as somebody who was getting a promotion into a next level job, and so we already know them then. And then, but I think the last thing is, it gives them an opportunity to demystify the board and ask us questions about, what does the board do? How are you thinking? How can we help you be more effective in your work? So it was very useful. I also think a couple of times a year we would go off-site, sometimes in connection with the AGM, sometimes it would be a visit to our New York office, our LA office, or our London office, where we have significant operations and significant people. And that gave us an opportunity sometimes to spend time with the clients of the organization, but always to spend time with the teams in these foreign theaters of operation, which is a very important element of understanding your culture.
So if I was on your board and traveling to London, I would probably follow a process of phoning you and saying, I'd like to meet some of the executives over there. Can you talk to Dave and see who he recommends? Would that be the channel that I ought to use as a director?
Well, we would set up those off-site or foreign office meetings with that already in mind. So we would have receptions, we would have presentations, the focus of the meeting. We would generally do that meeting in the absence of a quarter, so we weren't burdened with all of the regulatory compliance and disclosure issues. So we'd pick one of the dates, October, January were the two where we had meetings without quarters. And we'd really focus the agenda, pick London, on the businesses that we're in London, the people who are running those businesses in London, and really make them the focus of our time there. What happened?
I'm not sure what happened there, Katie. I have some questions while we're waiting for David to jump back in.
Okay.
Would you, as the chair? Oh,
yep. Go ahead.
You were touching on RBC, so a couple questions related to that. As the chair, would you participate in strategy development at RBC?
As the chair, not specifically away from board members. No, I didn't have a differential status with management on strategy in terms of the substance of strategy. That was management's role. The one place that I did sort of lean in was on the process for strategic review and for strategic extensions, whether that would be a new product line, a new business line, perhaps an acquisition. It could be those things. One of the things that I always encouraged management to do was make sure that they were bringing those ideas before they were fully baked. So to give you an example, we're thinking of expanding the footprint in the United States. what does that look like? Well, you could wait until management's identified a company that they're interested in speaking with, or you can start really early, educate the board on the market, educate the board on the market opportunities, identify some of the sweet spots of market opportunities, and then again at the next meeting, come back with a deep dive on the places where the organization might like to play, and then come back the following meeting with an update on what that work has brought. And eventually you start to narrow the aperture in on things that are actually potentially actionable. But by the time you get there, the board has already understood the market, understood the regions, understood the candidates. So really that elongating that strategic process so there's no surprises. It's very easy for the board to understand what's going on when they're given the opportunity. In this case, we're talking about an acquisition, to consider something like that. But it would apply to any number of strategic pivots that an organization might want to take.
And you had an offsite every year on strategy devoted only to our long-term future? Yeah.
We did. Every
and how
year,
did
yes.
that work? What did you do in terms of that? Just the executives? You bring in outside people with different perspectives, or what did you do?
Yes, we'd have usually a meeting that was not a quarter, so we could take the time to devote to the agenda matters. Obviously, strategy at these large organizations is not something that changes every year. Sometimes you're affirming something you decided to do last year. Sometimes you are perhaps pivoting or extending your risk appetite slightly to do some different things. But really setting up the agenda so that you're focused in on the areas that needed the most attention, whether that was because they were in a state of change or they were going to be in a state of change. And every year those generally would end up being a little bit different, but understanding the context of how that fit in to, again, the bigger picture. So not just bringing the issue itself, but setting the stage for what that means to the organization more broadly.
Yeah, good for you. And I think that it's important also to use it, in my experience, for some external points of view. Find a shareholder who doesn't own RBC, but does own another bank, and ask them, what's wrong about our resource allocation that causes you agony? Yeah, very good, very good. The other thing I noted is that McKinsey's book on successful CEOs with respect to cognitive biases was that the cognitive bias towards the board is that my job is to help the board help me. And I just really like that idea. Think of them not so much as police, but as a sort of a wise group of elders who've had tons of experience in various arenas. Who it's my job to bring them enough into my business so that they can help with their generic experience. Is that a correct characterization in your mind?
I think that's very correct. Obviously, the board is there from a governance perspective to be the stewards of the shareholders. But in order to be good at that, you really need to have this very effective and very transparent and very trusting relationship with the management team, so that when they need something, they're not hesitant to reach out. When we need something, we're not hesitant to reach out. And nobody is thinking that the other is in any way sort of trying to affect an outcome, create an outcome. But yes, back to your point from before, directors are there to provide their best advice. And the way that they can provide their best advice is if they've been given the information and the backdrop and done the work to get themselves ready to engage.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now, it's not your responsibility anymore, but one would think that succession planning for the current CEO is well underway. Time investment. I mean, I regard the selection of the CEO as a sacred job of the board. It's the only job that, in fact, the board does by itself. And if you get it wrong, nothing's going to work. So is there enough, talk about the investment made in the bank in terms of worrying and building plausible successions? Because we've had at least one bank in our arena who apparently had no successors available at the time of transition. And there may be another one just on the brink of doing that. So what is RBC, its HR committee, its whole board, its chair doing in terms of getting enough muscle and energy and thinking into that?
Well, I can't speak to
I
what
know,
they're
but
doing now,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah,
But my own perspective on CEO succession planning is very similar to yours. I do think that this is a critical job the board has. And as
yeah,
a result, it's one that the board has to spend a lot of time on. And it's not something that can be rushed. You can't decide that you're going to engage in succession planning and hope to be finished 12 months from now.
yeah.
So I like to say that succession planning for a new CEO begins the day the current CEO starts the job.
Oh, good for
Um,
you. Yes. Yeah.
and what do I mean by that? I don't mean that we run out and hire consultants and start looking at desktop searches for potential replacements. No, I just think that we start to focus in on talent at the senior level, generational talent at the next level
Mhm,
down.
mhm,
Obviously,
mhm.
emergency succession planning is something that boards have to do anyway. As soon as you get a brand new CEO, you have to worry about what would you do if
If,
something
yeah,
happened. And
right.
so active conversations around who might be the next generation of leaders in the bank, who might then emerge as a next generation CEO.
Hmm.
Very important, but staying current on all of that. And obviously, the longer you are into the tenure of a CEO, the more intense those conversations become.
Yeah.
But the CEO, the head of HR, the other business leaders in the business are all very important players in helping the board get the information it needs on the candidates who might be realistic successors to the senior team and the CEO.
And presumably building for them a program to enhance the
Oh,
skill
yes.
sets you might deem to be a little underdeveloped.
Absolutely. Executive development is a big part of this, whether you choose to do that in-house or
Yeah.
you choose to bring in an external service provider. I've done it both ways.
Mhm.
But ultimately you're there to try to give these next generation leaders the tools they need to grow. And a lot of
Yeah.
that, 70% of that is going to be, on the job learning. Some of it is going to be about transferring people from one vertical to another because you can't generally expect to become a senior leader in some of these very large roles coming up essentially through a single job. So making sure
Yeah.
people are getting that diverse experience,
Yeah.
getting them leadership opportunities outside the organization, whatever that might look like, whether it's
Yeah. Yeah.
heading the United Way campaign or serving on a hospital board or potentially serving on a subsidiary board, rounding them out so that they have a place where their own leadership skills can shine.
Yeah. This might be a little challenging, but you ran Four Seasons hotels for over 20 years and you were there for a longer time. It is the greatest company in the world, in my view. Consistent luxury service, still working on Izzy's principle, as do unto others as you would be done by. If you think
Yes.
about their hiring processes, their selection of executive processes, their training, what ideas were you able to bring over to the Royal Bank from that? Because I think the single greatest company I've ever come across is the Four Seasons, and you built it. So, what lessons from that come across to the Royal Bank as a chair?
Well, once again, I'm going to violently agree with you, David. I do think that Four Seasons is perhaps the greatest Canadian export story, and because it's not only a great company, it's a company that's great in today, I think 45 different countries,
Yeah, I
right?
think
It's
that's
it's
right.
it's
Yeah.
truly
Yeah.
an amazing story, and it is a people story. It's a
Yes.
it's a people story about leadership. I often refer to Four Seasons as a talent factory. What do I mean by that? The way the business works is that we need the best people in the whole world in order to be successful at each property. How do we get those people? We can grow them, we can recruit them, but ultimately that focus on the very, very, very best people was unrelenting. Who we hired, how we trained. It was just a constant reverberation. And of course, the way the business works is that hotels by nature are very, very pyramidal. So to get that top job, you have to come through a lot of different doors and be successful at all of them to get there. And not everybody is. But when you think about our business model, we manage the hotels on behalf of third parties. The constraint on our growth was not necessarily capital. Yes, we had to go out and find people that wanted to build these very, very expensive hotels and resorts. But from our perspective, the main governor on our growth was, did we have the people, the human capital required to open that hotel in Baku successfully? Because you and I know most of the people we hired into that hotel came from Baku. But how was it going to become a world-class Four Seasons? And I'm picking that one just because lots of people have not been there. But it would be true in Mumbai, it would be true in Bali, it would be true in the second hotel in Boston. It's the same everywhere. How do you get a great team put in place? You need great leadership. And so I would say, my time at Four Seasons just taught me over and over and over again, both in success and sometimes in not so successful, that nothing compares to the importance of great leadership anywhere.
Yeah. After 25 years of teaching strategy at the Rotman School, that's my one long-term differentiator for success, would be the quality of the talent you have in your organization. Number one.
I agree.
I think it's just, there's all kinds of other things happening in the world, but if you don't have great people in your organization, you're not going to have consistent long-term results, in my view.
Totally agree.
Let's move then from for-profit and move into Sick Kids, where you've been for 3.5 years now, the chair, and before that you were the chair of the foundation. Describe some of the differences between being the chair of a not-for-profit, in the case of the hospital, versus being the chair of a huge, vast international organization. What differences exist?
Yeah, well, I would say not as many differences as people might perceive there to be.
Okay.
Obviously, when you're chairing a foundation, you're essentially the chief fundraiser for the organization. And I was at the Sick Kids Foundation. I joined in 2004. I'm actually still cross-appointed here 20 plus years later. But it's a very, very big undertaking. And in the case of Sick Kids, both of the foundation board and the hospital board are relatively sizable boards, with a lot of very high profile people. We're very lucky to have the ability to attract incredible colleagues to those boards. The hospital is a big, complex place. Obviously, hospital boards are particularly special because of their life-saving capabilities, right? It's not the same as the kind of business you're running day in, day out, where human life is not on the line. It is for sure in a hospital, whether that's through the great work of the doctors or safety as a really, really big issue. The board of Sick Kids, and I'm sure this is true of other hospital boards as well, we have a lot of committees that are steered by my very capable chairs. I think if I'm right, it's about 7 committees in total. So it's a very, very busy board. Very busy board. We run a complex research institute. We have a quality and safety committee, which you wouldn't normally see in a financial institution, as an example. You would perhaps in mining and in manufacturing and in those sorts of places. But then more traditional committees, audit, HR, governance, would all fall into those categories. Real estate and facilities is again something that you have to worry about So they're very, very complicated. The meetings are the same constraints as in a public company. You've got a certain amount of time. You've got a lot to get through. A lot of important information, agenda management, back to our conversation from earlier, incredibly important, and board effectiveness. You've just got to keep on top of making sure you've got the best directors, the best management team. You've got a succession planning, both board and management looks very similar. So so it really is fantastic work. I would encourage anyone who's interested in starting their board career in the not-for-profit to take this up. You will learn enormous amounts of skills around governance and just what it takes to be a great board member. It's a wonderful place to not only train yourself but also to give back.
It also sounds more challenging in your description of it than, say, even running the largest company in Canada that's publicly traded.
In some respects, it can be, when last in the fall, when you've got RSV and flu season, and you can read in the paper what's happening in emergency departments. Yes, the stress on the management team is very, very intense, and so you're staying in touch with your CEO there, just the same way you're staying in touch with your CEO at a large corporate. But because they don't have as much infrastructure as a big one of the big five Canadian banks, you're probably you're relying on the board and the board members for a lot of additional work well beyond fundraising.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Well, I'm going to ask Quinn if there are any questions that came across in the last few minutes about Katie, her career, and her advice.
Can you please share some tools to invite comments from quiet members so that not the same someone adding too much value continues to do so?
Sure. With your quiet members, there's a couple of things I do. I keep track of everyone who speaks and in what order. I then make a point when it's time maybe for a second round or we're moving on to a new topic. I try to make a point of not going back to the same people in the same order. I try to mix it up and see if I can get some of the quieter people up to the top of the list in a more effective fashion. At the end of a session, if someone hasn't spoken at all, I might look over to them. Anything you'd like to add? Sometimes tough when you put people on the spot and they're not expecting that. But there's ways to kind of read the room and know what might be encouraged. I think the other thing I would say is that back to colleague interaction, whether it's part of the formal evaluation process or not. As I said, you're staying in touch with your colleagues all the time. And if you've got someone who you think can be contributing more but is not. So I'll give you a typical example is you've got somebody who's come onto your board. They've got a very strong vertical. Let's pick technology here for a second because that's so topical, and maybe it's AI today. But the idea is they come with this strong vertical, and that's what they've been recruited on. Making sure that they know that their repertoire is much broader than their vertical. They're not there to simply be the technology or the AI or the real estate or whatever their background expertise is. They're there to be a contributing director across, doesn't have to be on every issue, but on all the issues where they have something to contribute of value. And I often say to people, we just need more of you at the next meeting. And however you decide to show up, that's what we'd like to see. People would like to see more of you and understand more of what you're thinking.
Thanks for that answer. What would you say is the most precious support that you receive from a corporate secretary's role?
Corporate secretary's role, to me, is one of the most important facets of an effective board. So if your corporate secretary is not the strongest, you're ultimately going to always be leaving something behind. Corporate secretary is the inside person to negotiate with everybody around time allocation, around agendas. Board secretary come back to me and say, "Oh, audit needs another hour." Why? And then she'd have to go back and because that hour, back to finite time for a board, that hour has to be somebody else's hour that gets given up. It's not like you can just say, "Oh well, we'll extend the board meeting for 4 days and just let people know." Doesn't work like that. And so I would say time management and agenda setting. The corporate secretary is super important as the board chair's voice. And I always used to say to the corporate secretary, feel free to take my name in vain, because we've got to make sure this is a great board meeting. I think the other aspect to a great corporate secretary is just providing me with all the things I can't see. Information on the soft stuff, not necessarily the hard stuff, but the soft stuff. Keeping me on time inside the meeting itself. Making sure I'm seeing what's going on in a different way. But I think a really effective corporate secretary, and I've seen this in real time in different boards, not RBC, because I've always been blessed there with incredible corporate secretariat group, and it's not just one corporate secretary. Obviously, there's a whole team of people that are working to keep the board on track. But the difference a great corporate secretary makes cannot be underestimated.
During our prep call, you brought up educating not just the management, but the people below management around the function of a board. Can you bring up that story again and share that with everyone?
Of course. So David mentioned this earlier, and I'll rephrase it slightly, which is I say the board eats what management cooks, which is essentially the same concept. So ultimately the idea that you need to have great materials in order to have a great and wonderfully functioning board is just it just sort of sounds trite because it's so true. And if you get that piece wrong, then the board is coming having reviewed all of those materials, which takes hours and hours and hours. And if they're not properly framed and they're not properly scoped, it can be an Easter egg hunt to try to figure out what's the most important thing I'm supposed to look at here. Or it can be completely off point for what's going on in the meeting at that particular time. So if we go back to time being the scarcest resource and building a little bit on some of the things David talked about earlier, there's a great phrase in management, which is success is 10% strategy and 90% execution. We've all heard it. But one of the aspects of that for a board is great execution, in my opinion, is 90% planning and 10% doing. And so if we think about our 10% being the time we spend together in plenary or in committee, the preparation for that should be 9 times the volume in order to try to get it right. But that's an enormous undertaking to I'm not sure if I fully answered your question though.
I'm not sure either. I'm going to invite up another governance leader here, Jonathan Goodman, to ask a quick question, and then we will do wrap up. So this will be the last question.
Hi, Jonathan.
You're not on, Jonathan.
Quinn, I don't think I asked to ask a question, but that's okay. I found this. Did you cold call me, Quinn? Is that what you just did?
You have your hand up, so
oh well, I'm happy to ask. First of all, that was a masterclass. to Kathleen and David, so I can say that to both of you. An excellent session together. What I'd be interested in, what's the one thing that a chair, someone who's looking or aspiring to be a chair should think about from their own standpoint, not about the company, but about themselves and their temperament as to whether or not they're going to be a good fit generally? Lots that you've described specifically, but what's the general thing you'd say?
Well, I would say a couple of things. I got a really terrific piece of advice from a colleague when I had been chosen as the chair. And she said to me, the most important thing for you to remember is that you need to be the last among equals. And it was a really powerful phrase because embedded in it is two thoughts. The first is you need to be the last. And what she meant by that was that as the chair, you have unparalleled access to the CEO, to the management team, to the organization. We just finished talking about the material prep, the corporate secretary. So you come to a meeting having a different level of understanding and preparation than everyone else in the room. And so your job, first of all, is to make sure that you're, taking that step back and giving people the room they need to get caught up on the kinds of things that they have questions in their minds. The second part of that phrase, last among equals, is that there's no boss of a board. As a CEO, you are the boss of a company, but on a board, it is a very democratic grouping. You're all elected by the shareholders equally. The chair doesn't get special points from that perspective. And so this idea of needing to have very strong relationships with your colleagues who have essentially chosen you as a peer to be their organizational leader. Again, they didn't pick you to be their boss. They didn't pick you to tell them what to do. They want you to be their organizational leader and to be in charge of making the board effective and to take on that role we started with of special liaison to the CEO. So they're going to tell you all the things they want you to tell the CEO, and you're going to figure out when and how to do those things. So I think there's that to it, a mindset around the positioning of what a chair is there for. The second thing I would say,
I just want to flag the time for you, Katie. There.
Okay, I'll be quick. The second thing I would say is that you really need, as if you're aspiring to be a chair, get yourself some leadership roles on the board, because that's incredibly important, not only for colleagues to see you in a leadership setting, but also for them to get comfortable with the idea that you can take on more.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you, David. Sorry if this feels rushed, but they've both made it clear that they have to run at 2 p.m. I want to flag a call to action for Katie. You can, if you appreciate this class today, if you appreciate her work, contribute to Sick Kids and their foundation. So there's that. I would also want to flag on February 2nd, we have a usual contributor, Nick Darbo-Garno, who's going to not be talking about AI, but his other power expertise, which is around marketing and how boards, CEOs, and top management needs to think about growth and sales. So maybe, Katie, I know that you're recognized as a marketer. Do you have a comment on what boards need to do around sales and marketing?
Absolutely. I always say to people, revenue only exists in one place, the pocket of the customer. That's where it's at. So if your company wants to get more of what's in the pocket of your customers, your clients, your guests, whatever that may be, you need to understand those strategies, the effectiveness of those strategies. And of course, that whole landscape has changed hugely since I started my work as a public company board member. And ultimately, boards really need to understand the effectiveness of the sales strategy, of the customer outreach, of the socials, everything that goes into customer relationships. And Quinn, let me just say before we close, thank you for that shout out around sick kids. That's very kind. Really appreciate it. And thanks again, David, for having me and for everyone for listening.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.